Thank you, Patrick. Do you know, thinking back to my days here at Mac, more than ever, I am stunned to find myself standing here. And I'm more than a little disconcerted by all the nodding heads that I see with that assessment. At the time I was here at Mac, I was kind of careening through the curriculum, almost like a sailor on shore leave. I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do. I went from English to history to economics and history, and back and forth. And it wasn't until a while ago when I read a quotation from the philosopher Kierkegaard, who said the problem with life is it must be led forwards, but can only be understood backwards. So I should have known back then, at the time I was in my final year, and I should have been studying for my final exams. I was instead holed up in the library trying to write the great Canadian novel. I should have known that what I had done here at Mac was basically lay the groundwork, as chaotic as it was, to become, in that overworked word, a storyteller. And that's what I've done. I have told stories basically in 3 different genres. As was mentioned, I write novels, I will go off and do movies, or I will do documentaries. And sometimes they weave into one another. There was this mention by Patrick here about the queen of R&B, a woman named Ruth Brown. I was at CBS in New York. I was starting off a new magazine show for them, and all I wanted to work on was old-time rock and roll, the original R&B and the rock and rollers out of the late 40s and 50s. I met a woman named Ruth Brown, who was, in the late 40s, a huge star, and in the early 50s. And when I met her, she was destitute, and she was working as a cleaning lady. She later came back to be a star again. She's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame now, and all this, but I had started doing that was a kind of documentary film, and it morphed into a novel, a thing called Ivory Joe that I wrote, and the one thing crosses into the other all the time. I go back and forth between the genres. I want to introduce you today to a number of people, just a handful of people that I've met over the years, who in one way or another have given me some knowledge of the human condition, of the traits that make up a lot of the people on the planet, on kind of pulling back the curtain, as it were, in terms of what goes on in this world of personalities and traits and all this thing. I'm talking about things like charisma. I'm talking about courage. I'm talking about sometimes bravery and sometimes incredible cruelty. I've seen them all. Only I want to start with one of the easier ones right now, and that is charm. And I want to introduce you to the man who sort of introduced me to a lot of what I know about charm. Meet Vincent Vinnie Teresa, one of the most feared hitmen in the American mafia. Vinnie was doing very well in his chosen profession until one day he found out that his own people were going to whack him. So he fled. He fled to the FBI and the US government. He was put in what's called the Witness Protection Program. And he then was in hiding somewhere in the American West under a new identity. I wanted to get to him. So I arranged to meet him in the most unlikely place of all, in the heart of New York City. Now, New York has got 5 major mafia families. Any one of them would have loved to kill him. So I arranged to meet him 100 yards north of Grand Central Station in a high-rise office building, 245 Park Avenue. I will always remember that address. And he showed up surrounded by US Marshals at midnight. That was the time we were going to meet. So at midnight, he comes in. And these guys were armed to the teeth, and we go up the elevator, and I'm talking to him, and we start talking in the studio I'd set up in this office building up there. And he was charming. He was wonderfully funny. And I really got to like this guy. Amazing. It was really incredible. And we talk about stories and common things that we knew about, and suddenly my mind went into rewind. What did he just say? And what he had just said was, Oh, I'm so glad that this guy, he was my good friend, and he never saw when I put the bullet behind his ears. And I just said, whoa. And then we're talking funny and laughing and laughing and laughing more. And I thought, oh my God, this kept on going. You're talking about some guy that looked like a college student, and he never saw it when I got him here, you know? I mean, it was what I learned was the charm of evil. There is a subset of charm which some truly evil people have, and they can be your best friends, and you can be so enthralled in their presence. But I learned something from him. I learned, forget the smile, look at the eyes. The old quote that the eyes are the mirror of the soul. In this man, whatever was here, it was something that he had either never been born or was thoroughly dead. It was the deadest eyes I ever saw. And I used to look for dead eyes, and I saw it too often. Not all the time, but I would look for dead eyes amongst these people that I was dealing with. And too often, to be a coincidence, I would see dead eyes. Now the question is, why was I talking to him? I was talking to him for a series called Connections, which some of you may remember. It was an undercover series on organized crime, and we ran crazy sting operations halfway around the world. I started companies in Italy that were supposedly laundering money. We would do stings that went from Rome to London, England, to New York, to Atlantic City, to Toronto, to Beverly Hills. It was crazy. There was all sorts of things that we would do that later proved to be able to capture mobsters on camera. They would somehow blunder right into our lenses, and it got some pretty interesting stuff. This shot is from a scene in Montreal. It's a still frame from a film sequence, and it's my partner Bill McAdam and I deciding we're going to talk to Vic Catroni. Vic Catroni ran the Catroni family in Montreal, the most ruthless mob family in Canada, and one of the largest. It was kind of a branch plan operation of a huge New York organized crime family. And our attitude was we would just go up and talk to anybody. And we did. And often there was quite amazing results. This shot also is interesting because it shows why we were always in trouble with the CBC. Constantly in trouble with the CBC. In the first place, you can't schedule this, and the CBC runs on schedules. They need to know that they're going to have this done by this time or this done by that time. You can't schedule this. Also, you can't budget it. We blew the budget over and over, and the CBC was always ranting at us, and they were always calling us in for meetings, and we were on the carpet. Our standard response was, look, if we don't give you something that's great, then you can blame us, and we'll say it was our fault, and you can fire us. And there's something very liberating about telling the people you work for to fire you. You know, I mean, that really stops everything in its tracks. It also, too, just a sidebar on all this thing, we were always having turf wars with the bureaucracy in the CBC. And of course, it's a big organization, and there's all these outfits, and there's always bureaucrats. I would have to hire old vehicles. You always hired old vehicles for surveillance because new vehicles attract attention. You can't put a cameraman in a brand new shiny van or car or truck or anything. You just can't do that. So I would run off and I'd hire old vehicles almost on the street. If somebody had an old car that I liked or an old truck, I would offer the guy some money for a week or so. After the CBC Transportation Department heard about this, they were outraged. You can't do this. This is a turf war. You have to go through channels. You have to fill out all the forms in triplicate. You have to go through the channels. And we tried to be good people on this. So I went through channels, and I go down to the parking garage, and the transportation guy hands me the key to a brand new Hertz car. So this went on, and it happened a second time. And then I said, well, okay, we'll try it one more time. And now we had a real problem because we had a sting operation going. And we had to get to this place we were going, and we had to do surveillance filming, and we had no time to waste. So I went down to the parking garage to get the third vehicle, and it's a brand shiny new van. So the solution presented itself in terms of a big pillar, which I drove into. And then there's a pillar behind me, and I drove into that. And then there's a wall over here, and I drove up that side. I drove the wall down here. And within 5 minutes, I had a really nice old van. And the transportation department was screaming about lawsuits and insurance claims and all that. We didn't care. And that was what got us through, because you can fire us. So that was what got us through all this. Talking about charm. I want to talk about charm from somebody else on the world stage, and that's the dictator of Uganda, Idi Amin. You all know about Idi Amin, I'm sure. He was the murderous killer who took over Uganda and slaughtered thousands of his own people. He would pull judges off the bench and have them either shot or hacked to pieces if he didn't like their rulings. His own cabinet ministers were butchered. He had thousands of his people. If he didn't like what was happening, thousands would die. He was one of the most compellingly monstrous people of the latter part of the 20th century, and I wanted to get to him. Why did I want to get to him? Well, it goes back to when I was growing up in Etobicoke in Toronto. I couldn't wait each week for my father's copies of Time magazine and Life magazine, because I would devour them. And all this stuff was happening in the magazines. It was happening in Asia. It was happening in South America. It was happening in Europe, all over the place. And this crazy stuff was happening. And I'd look out the window, in the big plate glass window under Prince Edward Drive, and nothing was ever happening. I wanted to be where things were happening. But a postscript I discovered traveling the third world: you really don't want to live in a place where things are happening. It's much better to live in a place where you can look out the window and there's nothing happening, because places where things are happening, a lot of the times it's really, really bad stuff that's happening. So I had decided I wanted to see what made this man what he was. So I wanted to get to Uganda. Slight problem. Every other news organization in the world, big high-powered outfits like Der Spiegel over in Germany, the BBC, Times of London, New York Times, like CBS, all had hired teams of people and strategists and like foreign policy people and advisors to try and figure out how to get to him. He hated films. He hated all the journalists. He couldn't stand being interviewed. He was interviewed once or twice very early on and never again. He was done, and he hated the entire profession. So they couldn't get to him. And they had all these teams of people. But I, in Toronto, Canada, having never been to Uganda, let alone Africa, I knew the answer. I miss those days because I had decided what this man really wanted was love. Not just the love of any woman, but he wanted the love of the Queen of England. That was my grand strategy. And can you imagine walking in to a corner office, hard-boiled network news executives sitting there while you're explaining that theory? Can you imagine doing that? With the sideways glances of the eyes? But I was prepared. I had my standard speech. If I don't give you the film that's really going to be incredible, you can fire me, you can blame me, and all this stuff. And I heard somebody say, oh God, not this again, you know? So after a whole lot of toing and froing, I was going to go if I had to pay my own way over. So I owe a lot to Knowlton Nash, who a lot of you will probably remember, who just died a little while ago. He was the head of the news back then, and a young executive named Peter Herndorf. I owe a lot to them because finally one or the other of them just said, send a postcard. Off I went. And my plan wasn't as crazy as it sounds. I had done my research, and I knew from an obscure publication that Idi Amin, this monstrous murderer, he often talked about his fondest days when he was a member of the King's African Rifles. The King's African Rifles were a British kind of colonial outfit, and it was nominally controlled by the Queen. The Queen was the head of this outfit, obviously nominally. And he often talked to his close friends about how he knew the Queen really appreciated what he did, how he knew the Queen actually knew him personally, and all this kind of thing. He wanted to get back in the Queen's good graces, which was a problem because he had just been thrown out of the Commonwealth for all the atrocities. He and the country of Uganda were not welcome at the huge Commonwealth conference that was going to be held that year. And he wanted to go and he wanted to see the Queen. That was my theory. It so happened in that year that the president of the Commonwealth was Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister. That was a stroke of luck for me. And as I was working for Canadian broadcasting, in his mind, he would see it as being state broadcasting. He had the Ugandan state broadcasting, and everybody in there did exactly what he told them to. So he would think that I did exactly what Pierre had told me to do, that Trudeau was actually giving me the order to come to Uganda. So my plan was to try and get close enough to him to somehow blurt out what I could of that. And that was difficult. I finally got invited to a state it was a kind of garden party, and a huge thing on the front lawn of the State House. He was there, and you did not approach him. He had to approach you. If you approached him, he had all these guards and goons around you, and they would drag you away, and horrible things could happen. So I got as close as here to that projector away from him. And I blurted out my one sentence: I bring you greetings from Canadian State Broadcasting, who want to know if you would like to send a message. That's all I had time for before the goons dragged me away, and I thought, this is not going too well. However, he said, stop. And he asked somebody around him, what did that man say? And they kind of told him, and he said, come here. And I said exactly what I said again. And he said, wait. So I waited. I waited 1 day, 2 days. I had to send the camera crew back to Nairobi, Kenya. I was there on my own in an empty hotel with drunken army officers. It was quite a hairy time. I waited 4 days, a week, 10 days, and finally I got a phone call saying, show up the next day at a certain place. I got the interview. But I was waiting for him, had the camera all set up, and I hear this noise of a car roaring in. And it's a Citroen Maserati, a car that was made in those days, and it's one of these incredible cars. And he comes barreling up in the car on his own in a cloud of dust and gets out, and he is charming. He is friendly and chuckly, and he was my best friend at that moment. He was great. So we start the interview. And you'll notice I'm calm and relaxed and savoir-faire and all this stuff. No, that was like I was almost catatonic here, because a couple of things quickly became apparent. One was pure professional vanity. This was going to be seen in every news organization around the entire world, and it had better be good, because if it wasn't, I was going to get killed for this one opportunity. All these outfits, the BBC, CBS, the Times of London, I was standing in for them at that time, so I better make it good. The second thing was, in order to make it good, I was going to have to do a tough interview, but all of my normal interviewing tactics were gone out the window, because there was a theory that he was clinically paranoid, that he would turn on people in a flash, and that happened in all kinds of ways. So that if I asked the wrong question, boy, you're in real trouble. So I want to talk for a second about the art of doing the interviews, because interviewing is an art form, and there are very, very few people who are good at it. I was lucky enough to see some of the masters, and there's a couple of tactics which I would normally use with anybody who was trying to cover something up. If you're up against a person who's trying to conceal the truth, you can do a couple of things. One is, you turn yourself into a combination of a trial lawyer and a chess player. You start by asking a bunch of innocuous questions, and then you hone in with this topic A, let's call it, that you really want to know the truth about. You ask a question about topic A, and then you go on, you ask a whole bunch of other questions, and you ask another question about topic A from another point of view. And then you go on with some more questions, and you ask about the same topic A from a totally different perspective. And if people are covering stuff up, they often can't keep their answers straight. And the answer here is usually different from here to here. And that's the wedge. You drive into all the discrepancies and you drive into that. That is a tool that I wasn't going to use with him because I didn't want to end up floating in the Nile. The other tactic, which is a tremendously interesting tactic when you're doing an interview, is exactly silence. Silence terrifies people. You got it. You get the gold star. But silence makes people want to talk. I saw it the first time with an old-time interviewer doing one of these, question, answer, and he asked a tough question he'd always been answering, and the guy gave the stock answer he'd always been preparing and expected the microphone to be pulled back, but it wasn't. It was just left there. And silence. And the guy panicked in his eyes, and he started talking, and he revealed all the things he was intent on trying to cover up. I was not going to do that either with Idi Amin. So I approached it sideways with questions like, well, you must need a lot of security. And then I almost said, well, lots of leaders around the world need security, one of those. And he said, no, I don't need security. I'm fine. And I said, really? And he said, sure, you saw me drive in. I didn't have security, which is true. So I said, well, you can't just drive around town on your own. I mean, people wanted to kill this guy, a lot of people. He said, my people love me. I can drive anywhere I want. So I suddenly said, wow. The voice went off in my head saying, I'm going to ask him a question. Are you, okay then, would you take me on a tour of Kampala, the capital? Just you and me. I expect him to say, no, I can't do it, or I'll get back to you or something. And he said, sure. I thought, oh my God. So here's me and Edie on my tour of Kampala, my guided tour of Kampala. And I would say, turn left, he'd turn left, turn right, go here, go there, go there. And he was charming. Again, funny, great, wonderful. But I said, I gotta have a payoff to this. So I thought the Central Market. The Central Market is a place where there are thousands of people. That's going to be a real testing ground. I said, let's go to the Central Market. He said, sure. So we got here. He drove in. We drove in, and the whole place froze. You could just see there were all pillars of salt. And he got out of the car, and they didn't know what was going on. And he waved to them. And suddenly they went crazy. They went wild, cheering and yelling and whooping. Two things on this. One is this is very possibly a reaction to fear, which obviously it was in a lot of cases, but something else was at work here, charisma. I saw in a few people I have met in all these travels, raw charisma. You cannot really define it. You can't quantify it. You can't come up with a formula for it. Some people had it. I saw him speaking Swahili, and what a force of nature he was. So just before I leave him, there's a couple of postscripts about this. One is that I had sent the film of the interview to be processed in London, England, while I was still there. I was afraid if he turned on me, I would be in trouble and the film would be destroyed and there would be absolutely nothing. So we sent the film to London, and thank God I got out of there just as the film was coming out of the bath, and all these people were starting to look at it, because before I got back to Canada, it was on the BBC and then on 60 Minutes. And by the time I got back to Canada, he was raging at me. He thought I was a spy for the Americans, for the British. He demanded I be sent back to be tried for treason or something. Needless to say, I did not go back to Kampala. The other thing, too, was that car we were driving around in, the Citroen Maserati, he would have people drive in it. There were kind of body doubles just from time to time. 3 weeks after I left, that car was machine gunned, and the guys inside died. There's a movie called The Last King of Scotland, which has to do with a lot of what I was involved in that episode. But let's stick with charisma for a minute. there's an example closer to home, and a lot of us know it, in the form of Trudeau-mania. I'm sure you all remember those days when Pierre Trudeau was the rock star of politicians. He had the adulation. I was up on the stage when he was crowned, and that was the word, really, crowned, to take over the Liberal Party. And it was amazing charisma. I hadn't seen anything like it. I traveled with him quite a bit. For instance, there was a tour of Russia. I was in charge of the CBC's coverage, and I spent 3 or 4 weeks in Russia. He was over there for about 10 days or so. It was quite an amazing trip. The Russians pulled out all the stops. They wanted to make him their friend. They wanted to make him the adversary to Nixon at the time. It was an amazing trip, and I saw him up close. I can't say I ever got to know him at all. I don't think anybody got to know Trudeau. But something happened not long after that, which gave me a laboratory experiment into charisma. We were doing an interview in his office up on Parliament Hill. His office was over here, a tiny little hallway, probably 3 times the length of this desk, joined his office to the office over here where the assistants and all the secretaries would sit. So I could look, I stood in this little hallway. I could look this way and see the real Pierre Trudeau. I could look this way and put my headphones on and see it on the television screen. I had a monitor right here. I could look at what was on the TV, what would go out on the network. Funny thing happened. I looked over here, and it was boring. And Pierre was sitting there, remember that nasal voice he had, kind of droning on, shrugging, and it was boring. I put my headphones on and looked over here, and it came to life. It was amazing. All the drony qualities somehow crackled, all that kind of shrugging boredness looked like bemused, great. I saw charisma bottled through Marshall McLuhan's philosophy. And McLuhan, who I met several times and I couldn't stand, I thought he was a genius, because here there were some people, and this was again a laboratory experiment, some people have that quality which translates, they are cool in terms of McLuhan's terms. It translates into the coolness of the medium. And that small screen has so often made leaders who are not that charismatic in person, but somehow that small screen transforms them. I want to change for a minute from the small screen to the big screen. Here I'm talking about Hollywood and movies. I grew up in Toronto as part of a British family, and one thing the Brits did in those days, a lot of them would go to the International Cinema on Yonge Street, where British films had been flown over from London and they were shown on Saturday afternoons. I was raised on the Ealing comedies, on films like The Cruel Sea, Tight Little Island, No Highway in the Sky. I love British films. And all the way up to Lawrence of Arabia, of course, which was later, but I mean, great British films. I wanted to be a storyteller in film. I wanted to be a director and a writer. I wanted to make movies. So while I was careening around the world, doing all the stories that I was doing in Africa and all over South America, and I saw these coups d'etats, I came up with a script that was about a group of officers plotting in the background to overthrow the government. It happened all the time, and it seemed to work. We got a lot of attention, but I decided I have to make my movie. And this is really the first movie I made. There was a tiny little film I'd made before that was almost a student film. I decided, okay, I like Lawrence of Arabia. I need Peter O'Toole. And of course, that was ridiculous. Only it wasn't. Because I was able to get the Peter O'Toole. And you just didn't do that. You just didn't offer all these films from a director who had never directed anything, from somebody who had no track record like I did. And Peter gave me the gift of grace. He listened to me after I somehow got through to him. He listened first with irritation, then with bemusement, then with interest, and then with active encouragement. And I learned that as much as I wanted to repay him after that was over, I never could. There was no way I could repay him. And I learned that you need to pay it forward, that you need to keep it going and pay back those who did not necessarily do you a favor, but on behalf of somebody who did. And Peter was quite mad and eccentric and wonderful, and I owed him a great deal of gratitude. From Lawrence of Arabia, too, not that long ago, sometime around 9/11, I was doing a film with Stallone and Madeline Stowe, and I wanted to work with Anthony Quinn. Now, you will remember Anthony Quinn from films like Zorba the Greek, and there was Lawrence of Arabia, and all the way back to Fellini. He and I just sort of bonded right off the start. Once in a while in your life, you meet somebody and you click. It just happens a few times in one's life. And he and I, for some reason, we just clicked. But one day I showed up on the set, and he had his big day. He had a lot of lines, a lot of acting to do, and I saw something I'd never seen. He was afraid. He was nervous. And so I took him aside, and we talked for a while, and he was really, really nervous. I said, "You're the dumbest guy I know." I said, "You're afraid with your career. Then the rest of us should be terrified to be working with you. I mean, you have no business being afraid." He looked at me, he glared, he went off. I called action as quick as I could to get it going, and he was terrific with that fire that he always had. It wasn't so much learning a lesson as reaffirming one that I've always felt. On the stuff I do, the bigger projects I do, I want to be afraid too. I want to be nervous. I don't want to go into something just really casual. I want to feel that I haven't done it before, and I'm really, really on the line here. And I was thrilled that he felt the same way with his career, with all the awards and everything. So there was one other thing about him too that was really strange, really bizarre. He said to me one day, "Look, all this," and he did this fluttering motion, "all this is going to go soon. But you will see me. Listen to me," he said, "you will see me in the bright blue sky and the billowing clouds. You will see me in trees under those billowing clouds, big, huge trees on rolling hills with a river running through it." I thought, okay. And he said, "No, listen, you will see me." So I said, okay. And everything went on. And several months later, I get a phone call. I was in Sicily. I got a call on my cell phone from his wife. He had died that morning. He had written me a letter on the last afternoon of his life that he had wanted her to get to me, which he did. It's obviously a very private letter, but when I read it, I should have known what was coming. Because about a year later, maybe, I got a call from Columbia Pictures in Hollywood, and they want me to inaugurate one of their studios. They were doing all these beautiful new screening theaters, a theater that was named after Kirk Douglas. They were naming them all after famous actors. The Kirk Douglas Theater, there was the Cary Grant Theater, and now they wanted the Anthony Quinn Theater. So they asked me, would I make the benediction, the eulogy benediction of the opening remarks at this theater? I said, sure. So on a Friday night in Hollywood, in front of a huge Hollywood crowd, I go into this theater. And I have a speech prepared. And so it's time to walk down the aisle. I walk down the aisle. I had two thoughts. One was, boy, Raquel Welch looks just as good as she did all those years ago. And the second thought was, this place is so luxurious, unbelievable. Plush seating, rosewood everywhere, and murals, these beautiful Japanese murals everywhere. It was incredible. So I got in this, so I'm at the front, I'm about to start, and suddenly I hear him laughing at me. Because I did hear him, I did see him. There was a painting all over the ceiling, exactly as he had said. Pure coincidence. There were the billowing clouds against the crystalline blue sky and the billowing trees and hill, just what he told me. I'm still trying to figure out what the lesson in that is. I don't have a clue. But nonetheless, I just thought, I guess it's mysticism. It was his Irish-Mexican like mysticism coming out of there. So I want to do a detour right now and take us into war, combat, and the qualities of bravery and courage that are exemplified by very few people like Juliet Furneaux. I met Juliet Furneaux as she was coming out of Afghanistan. At the time, the Soviets were in there. She's a young French doctor. She was engaged to a young American doctor who was also there. She led a French aid team called Médecins Sans Frontières. And they would take medical supplies way into Afghanistan. And it was horrendously dangerous to go into Afghanistan at that time. There were no roads. There was no way you could go in. You would have to disguise yourself. You would go in, and if you were found in there, it was almost guaranteed that you would be machine gunned by a Soviet helicopter. They were all over the place, and they would machine gun anybody they saw. It happened over and over again. She existed in a world of men, Afghan men. And you've all heard stories about the plight of Afghan women. You've all seen them in the burqas, head to toe with only the mesh across the eyes. It is truly breathtaking. You need to see it to really understand it, how oppressive it is over there for women. I was stunned. She was leading a mule train across the Hindu Kush Mountains, which are 25,000 feet, cold and brutal, and as I said, if they were caught, they would be machine gunned. She led a huge mule train, manned, and that is the word, manned by Afghan men. And there is something about the force of conviction, which can move history, can shape movements, but to see it in action and what moved those men to take orders from a young woman who, if you met her, she was demure, she was almost shy. What moved them to keep going at her instructions was the force of conviction. And it's quite something when you see it in action. It was really quite amazing. I want to stay on the topic of conviction briefly, but first of all, I need to talk to you about selfies. We've all seen selfies, where you take out the camera, you take a picture of yourself. You all saw the Academy Awards. I think I took one of the first selfies. This was taken in the mirror of a cheap hotel in northern Pakistan. I had just stumbled out from inside Afghanistan. I was dressed in Afghan clothing and the whole bit. I'd been inside in combat. And I wanted to know if I was the same on the outside, because I felt everything had changed on the inside. It had changed because of what this man, Wakil Akbarzai, had said to me in one moment. He was one of the leaders of an Afghan resistance movement. And I'd been flying between Toronto and Paris, where the aid groups were stationed, to Islamabad, Pakistan, and then up to Peshawar for a year, just trying to get there okay to go inside. Then one day he told me that you have to stand by the side of the road at midnight, and we'll have somebody come and pick you up. So I was at the side of this lonely Pakistani road. At midnight, a car comes up, I jump in, they take me to this huge fortress where all the Afghans are there. It took 36 hours of walking and being smuggled to get inside Afghanistan. I traveled with 4 Afghans who spoke no English for hours and hours and hours. I didn't know where I was going. And we started climbing the mountains. And we went up and up and up on the mountains. And finally, we came to this place, this ledge, high up on a mountain. And there was a wooden door in the side of the mountain. So they opened the door, and this is what I saw. There's a huge cave inside with all these Afghan fighters, and all their bullet belts and rifles and everything hung above them in the walls. It was a truly bizarre, huge cave, probably the dimensions of this room and as high. It was quite astonishing. That's where I slept that night, staring up at the bullet belts, and I thought, you're a long way from home, pal. Early next morning, we were up and trekking up the mountains. They were going to attack a Soviet fort way down below, like 5,000 feet below, and they were going to do this kind of harassing action where they would fire down and then flee. So that was my morning with these guys. Over and over again, while I was inside, we would go off to war. Oftentimes, here is how we went. In this little Toyota 4Runner, there were no roads there. You just bounce over hill and dale, and all these mujahideen, all packed inside. And here's the view from inside the truck. I was pressed against the cab. You can see a little wedge of daylight up there. And all these guys were inside, and they would go in search of all gunfire. And if they found it, they would start attacking. They blew up an ammunition dump while I was there. And every once in a while, when they got bored, they would have lunch. And lunch was quite astonishing. Fresh food all over the place. I don't know how it came or like where it came from. But then one day, this guy, Wakil again, he was in the truck with us. Ordinarily, there's nobody that spoke English. He was riding with us one day, and we stop. The truck stops dead. And I think, where? And I heard helicopters around. It was really spooky. So we get out, and we're in a dried out kind of a wadi, like a riverbed. And there's high walls on either side. There was nowhere to flee to. You could not flee. So I said, this is really not a good place to be. And I went up to him and said, why are we stopping? It's time to pray. I said, can't we pray somewhere else? No, time to pray. Well, can't you pray a few minutes later? No. So I said to him, but listen, those are Soviet helicopters. And listen, look, all these are tank tracks, and these are fresh tracks. We could die. And he said what turned my mind inside out. He looked at me almost like a teacher looks at a slow pupil. So we die. And I thought, oh my goodness. And remember, this is way before 9/11. This is way before we heard anything about suicide bombers. Way before all that. And suddenly, so we die. And they prayed right there with helicopters just over whatever ridge was over there. And I thought, I hope we never have to face these guys in combat. And B, I said to myself, so we die. I come from Western civilization with the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason and the collective aspirations of mankind. And I mean, we have things like all the anti-aging creams. And so we die? That does not make any sense at all. That's why I took the selfie. I wanted to see if I was still the same on the outside, because inside, everything had been jumbled up. So we die was not the idea that Charlie Martyn had years ago. I know we've heard a lot recently about Normandy, but I had my own experience on Normandy that changed how I see my life and all of your lives. I went over to Normandy with Charlie, who was a member of the Queen's Own Rifles, on the 50th anniversary, 1994. I took Charlie over there, and he had been one of the most heroic. He had landed on the beach as the first off, and I think I didn't do him a favor. I think I did something bad with Charlie, because I thought he would remember. Instead, what happened was he started to relive. And this is Charlie, having just seen, old Charlie, having just seen a grave of somebody who was his closest friend. Charlie's crying. We were all crying. It was one of those amazing moments that we just felt, oh my God, have we done the right thing? I took Charlie up the beach. It was the first 24 hours. We were retracing that 24 hours. And I took him up the beach and had this kind of epiphany. This is the pitiless Juno Beach. And you've all seen shots of the beach in the last 24 hours, I'm sure. But imagine a football field of sand. This would have been the view from the German pillbox. And the pillbox was about the size of a living room with walls as thick as this desk. And there would be machine gunners in there raking the beach. And Charlie and his friends would have to land in here somewhere and run all the way. And Charlie, as we walked up the beach, it was Tommy got it here. And oh, Freddie got it here. And oh my goodness, that's where Sam got it. And suddenly I thought I'd always known how lucky we were in terms of the where of our lives. I mean, travel the third world enough and go to some of these countries that I've gone to. And we, as we all know, are so lucky being born here, raised here, living here, the educational system and all the rest of it. We are just flat out lucky. That's the where of our lives. I also thought about the when of our lives at that moment, because that was just one generation separating Charlie and those guys from me, from us. One single fly speck of time, one little tiny generation. That could have been us. And I suddenly thought of all the guys I played football with. I mean, we had trained for 3 years in a physical thing and trying to prevail, and we got trophies. They trained for 3 years on a physical activity, and they got machine guns. And that could have been all of us. That could have been Buck and Vince and Ken and Peter and all of us, and Mimo and Nenad and all of us on the Marauders. We would have been running up, because Charlie and his friends, small town Southern Ontario boys, all who went to church, they were, and I say this with complete kindness, ordinary people. These were not Navy SEALs. These were not trained soldiers. These were accountants, plumbers. These were bookkeepers. These were school teachers who had a gun thrust at them. And the more I talked to them, the more I thought, boy, are we lucky. And that's when I started thinking about the when of our lives. I was also personally lucky because all I've told you could never have happened if something else had not occurred. I was here at McMaster, and I was supposed to take over my father's company. He had a company that sold and overhauled bulldozers. I don't like bulldozers. I have no interest in taking over the company. And I was in a panic because that was all we knew, was to go into business. If you didn't go into the business, then you'd probably either starve or become a communist or something. I mean, it was just, that was all I knew. So when I was here at Mac, I was in a panic, but good luck struck. In the form of the room assignment I was given at 4th floor Whidden Hall, I was given a room right next to the only single room in that part of the hall. And in that single room next to me, a strange, almost phantom-like guy was in there. We never saw this guy. He was somebody who would sleep late. He would vanish at nights. We would never see him. And there would be sightings of this guy stalking across the campus at night, scarf in the wind and carrying a case. And I got to talk to him. I was one of the only guys in the hall who ever saw him because I slept in as late as he did. And that's how we met. We started talking. So I started talking to Bruce Littlejohn. And he was in the arts. He was a post-grad history student, supposedly, but really what he was a jazz musician. And he played trombone. And he was going to places like Greenwich Village in Europe. I was sure he played with Chet Baker in Amsterdam. And he was leading a life that was so different from what I understood. That he wasn't starving. He wasn't a communist. He was just a jazz musician. And we started talking. And Bruce, who led the McMaster jazz band, Bruce and I would talk and talk and talk. I became more friendly with him. And he would talk about how he would go with the Duke Ellington Orchestra and in New York with Louis Armstrong's orchestra. And in that year, when I knew Bruce, something inside me shifted. Because soon after I got out of McMaster, good people, good, solid, serious people offered me a good, solid, serious job. And I was able to say, you know, there's a war going on in Vietnam. I think I'll go there. And that line had been unknowingly written for me by Bruce. Now, Bruce, I lost touch with him for the better part of a lifetime. And several years ago, I got a place up in Muskoka, and it turned out Bruce lives in Muskoka. He lives up in Bracebridge. And Bruce has been fighting a pretty protracted battle with Father Time, and Father Time has been exacting its toll on him. But Bruce and I get together for old time's sake. And I try to tell him how much I owe him. It came most clear last year when I was at his place and I saw a battered old case, the trombone case, the case that he would carry when he was changing my life back then. And he was going to give it away because he can't play it anymore. I said, Bruce, you can't give that away. He didn't understand why, and I'm not sure I totally understood why either. I realized that trombone had been providing me with the soundtrack, the unheard music that's gone behind all I've done and all I will do. And along with it are the lyrics that are written in gratitude. And for that, I say thank you.